I knew the HOA in my neighborhood was bad, but I didn't realize how far they'd go until Karren showed up at my doorstep, clipboard in hand and a smug look on her face. She was the self-appointed queen of the HOA, and from day one, she had it out for me. Maybe it was because I didn't attend her ridiculous meetings. Maybe it was because I refused to let her dictate what color I painted my shutters. Or maybe it was just because she thrived on making people miserable. But this was a whole new level of insanity. "I'm here to inform you that your backyard is actually part of the community land," she announced, tapping her pen against her clipboard like she was some kind of government official. "You've been illegally fencing it in, and the HOA has decided it needs to be accessible for all residents." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. "You're joking," she pursed her lips. "I don't joke about HOA regulations." I let out a short laugh. "Karren, I have the property deed, that land is mine," she sniffed, flipping through her papers. "Well, the HOA has determined otherwise. You have 1 week to remove your fence or we will do it for you and fine you for obstruction." Now, I don't get mad easily, but this lit a fire in me. I had owned my home for years. My backyard was where I grilled on Sundays, where my dog ran around, where my niece played when she visited. And now Karren thought she could just take it. I stepped forward, lowering my voice. "You touch my fence and I'll have you charged with trespassing." She didn't back down. "The HOA has final say." I shut the door in her face before I said something I'd regret, but I wasn't about to let this go. If Karren wanted to play games, I'd show her exactly who she was messing with. I didn't waste a second after slamming the door on Karren. If the HOA thought they could claim my backyard as community land, they had another thing coming. I grabbed my property deed from my filing cabinet, then pulled up the county assessor's website. My lot boundaries were crystal clear. There was no way the HOA had any legal claim to my backyard. But I knew Karren. She didn't care about legalities. She cared about control. If I waited for her next move, I'd be playing defense. That wasn't going to happen. I called my friend Mark, a contractor who had dealt with HOA nightmares before. He answered on the second ring. I explained the situation and he let out a low whistle. "Sounds like classic HOA overreach. What's your plan?" "I want a fence, a real one, something they can't just tear down." Mark chuckled. "You want something decorative or something that sends a message?" "I want something that makes them regret ever messing with me." We met the next morning to go over options. Mark laid out a few designs, but I had something a little more extreme in mind. "How high can we legally go?" I asked. Mark pulled up the local zoning laws. 6 feet is the limit without a special permit. If you go higher, they'll try to use that against you. 6 feet would do, but I wasn't stopping at just a fence. I had a plan that would make Karren and her cronies think twice before pulling a stunt like this on anyone else. While Mark got to work on the materials, I paid a visit to my lawyer, Lisa. She'd helped me before when the HOA tried to fine me for parking my truck in my own driveway. She had a no-nonsense attitude that made her perfect for dealing with people like Karren. Lisa reviewed my deed and the HOA bylaws. "They don't have a legal leg to stand on," she said, "but they're counting on intimidation. If they try to remove your fence, that's destruction of private property. They'd be liable for damages." I grinned. "Good to know. Can you draft a cease and desist?" "I want it ready for when they inevitably escalate," Lisa nodded. "I'll have it to you by the end of the day." By the time I got home, Mark's crew had already started digging the post holes. Karren was watching from her porch, arms crossed, probably calculating her next move. I ignored her. The new fence went up fast, 6 feet of reinforced steel bars with a locking gate. But that wasn't the best part. I installed security cameras facing every angle of the fence. If anyone so much as touched it, I'd have video evidence. The finishing touch. A large sign on the gate that read, "Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. The next morning, I woke up to furious banging on my front door. I didn't need to guess who it was. I opened the door to find Karren standing there, HOA rulebook in hand. She didn't even wait for me to say anything. "That fence is an eyesore," she snapped. "It's against HOA guidelines." I leaned against the doorframe. "Funny, because your rules only cover perimeter fences. This is in my backyard, which, just to remind you, is legally mine." Her face turned red. "You had no right to put up something like that without approval." "I don't need approval to protect my property from trespassers." Her eyes darted to the security cameras. She knew she couldn't order her lackeys to tear it down without consequences, but I could see the gears turning in her head. She wasn't going to give up that easily. Sure enough, the next day I got a letter from the HOA claiming my fence was in violation of community aesthetics and demanding that I remove it. They also threatened a daily fine if I didn't comply. I laughed as I read it. Then I forwarded it to Lisa. A few hours later, I had her response in my inbox, a formal legal notice warning the HOA that any attempt to fine me would be met with immediate legal action. I printed out a copy and hand-delivered it to Karren's mailbox. That night, I checked my security camera footage out of curiosity. Sure enough, at around 2 in the morning, a figure crept up to my fence and rattled the gate. The camera's motion-activated lights kicked on, revealing none other than Karren herself. I shook my head. Did she really think she could sneak onto my property after everything I'd put in place? I made a few extra copies of the footage and sent one to Lisa. Then I prepared for my next move. Karren wanted a battle. She was about to get a war. The morning after catching Karren on my security cameras, I wasted no time. I sent Lisa the footage, letting her know that the HOA president had trespassed on my property in the dead of night. Lisa, never one to waste time on nonsense, called me within the hour. "This is perfect," she said without preamble. "Not only does this prove she's harassing you, but it also strengthens your case if they try to fine you again. No judge is going to take their side when their own president is skulking around like a burglar." I nodded, already thinking 2 steps ahead. "I want to take this to the HOA board meeting." "Publicly?" Lisa let out a low chuckle. "I like the way you think. Just make sure everything is documented. Bring copies of the footage, the property deed, and my legal notice. If they push back, we'll escalate." That was exactly what I planned to do. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for that evening in the community center. Normally, I avoided these gatherings like the plague, but this time I arrived early, taking a seat in the front row with a thick folder of documents. The room was filled with the usual crowd of HOA loyalists, the types who enforced grass-length regulations like their lives depended on it. Karren sat at the head of the table, her expression sour the moment she saw me. She started the meeting with the usual dull agenda: financial reports, upcoming community events, the same nonsense that had no real impact on anyone's lives. I waited patiently until the floor was opened for community concerns. The moment she asked if anyone had any issues to bring forward, I stood. "I have a serious matter regarding my property," I announced, my voice steady. "Specifically, the repeated harassment I've been receiving from this HOA." Murmurs spread through the room. Karren's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is not the time for personal grievances," I cut her off smoothly. "It's not a personal grievance when the HOA is overstepping its legal authority." I reached into my folder and pulled out a printed frame of the security footage clear as day, showing Karren rattling the gate of my newly built fence in the middle of the night. I held it up for the entire room to see. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, whispers, a few people exchanging looks of disbelief. Karren's face drained of color. "This was taken by my security cameras last night," I continued, my voice carrying through the room. It shows our HOA president attempting to access my private property that, I should remind everyone, has been falsely claimed as community land. Karren's mouth opened and closed, her composure cracking. That's not what it looks like, I raised an eyebrow. Then please enlighten us. What exactly were you doing on my property in the middle of the night? She floundered, looking to the other board members for support. A few of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly wanting no part in this disaster. Before she could come up with an excuse, I continued. I have my property deed right here, which proves beyond any doubt that my backyard is mine. I also have a legal notice from my attorney stating that any further harassment from this HOA will result in legal action. I handed out copies to the board members, who scanned them with furrowed brows. This HOA has no authority to claim my land. And yet, not only did Karren attempt to intimidate me into giving it up, but she also trespassed on my property. I'd like to know how the board plans to address this blatant abuse of power. Silence hung in the air. Karren's face had turned an alarming shade of red, her hands gripping the table. One of the board members, an older man with glasses, cleared his throat. This is concerning. I wasn't aware of any attempts to claim personal property as community land. Another woman on the board nodded hesitantly. Neither was I. If this is true, it could put the HOA in legal jeopardy. Karren shot them both a warning glare, but the damage was done. The room had turned against her. Seeing my opening, I pressed forward. I'm also requesting that the HOA formally acknowledges that my backyard is private property and ceases any further attempts to interfere with it. More murmurs spread through the room. The board members exchanged glances, clearly realizing that siding with Karren would only drag them down with her. Finally, the man with glasses sighed. I think we need to consult legal counsel before making any further claims about property ownership. Until then, no actions should be taken against, he looked at me. Your property. It wasn't quite the public humiliation I had hoped for, but it was a victory nonetheless. The HOA had been forced to back down, and Karren was visibly seething. But I wasn't finished yet. I turned to the rest of the room. And while we're at it, maybe it's time we take a closer look at how this HOA is being run. If Karren is willing to lie about property lines, what else has she been manipulating? That set off a fresh wave of murmurs. People were paying attention now, questioning things they had previously accepted without thought. Karren shot to her feet. This meeting is over, she snapped, grabbing her papers and storming out. I watched her go, satisfied. She had lost control of the situation and she knew it. As the meeting wrapped up, several neighbors approached me, thanking me for standing up to her. A few even mentioned wanting to call for a leadership vote at the next HOA election. I walked out of that room knowing Karren's reign was crumbling. And I was going to make sure she never had the power to pull something like this again. After the HOA meeting, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers about Karren's late-night trespassing. People who had once blindly followed her were now questioning her decisions. It was exactly the kind of shift I had been hoping for, but I knew better than to assume she would just slink away quietly. Karren wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. The next morning, as I stepped outside to grab my mail, I noticed a car idling at the end of my driveway. A man in a suit sat in the driver's seat, talking on the phone, occasionally glancing in my direction. He wasn't a familiar face, which meant one thing Karren had called in reinforcements. Sure enough, before I could even step back inside, a second car pulled up, and out stepped a tall, thin man with slicked-back hair and a briefcase. He approached with the kind of forced smile that screamed legal trouble. I waited on my porch, arms crossed, as he stopped at the bottom of my steps. He introduced himself as Richard Langley, the HOA's legal counsel. His tone was overly polite, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. He wasn't here for a friendly chat. He cut straight to the point. The HOA was demanding that I remove my fence immediately. According to him, the board had reassessed their stance and determined it was still in violation of unspecified community regulations. I didn't even try to hold back my laughter. The legal notice from Lisa was airtight, and they knew it. This was nothing more than a desperate attempt to intimidate me into backing down. I let Richard finish his rehearsed speech before responding with one simple question. Which regulation exactly? His smile faltered just a bit. He flipped through his papers, stalling. I pressed on, pointing out that my fence was well within legal height limits on my own property and fully documented as such. I also casually mentioned the security footage of Karren's trespassing, which I had already shared with my attorney. Richard's confident demeanor dimmed as he realized I wasn't some pushover homeowner he could steamroll. He adjusted his tie, muttered something about further review, and left without another word. By the time he reached his car, I had already sent Lisa a text. If the HOA wanted to escalate this, I was more than ready. That afternoon, I noticed something even more suspicious. A couple of HOA board members were walking the perimeter of my fence, taking notes and snapping photos. They didn't acknowledge me when I stepped outside, but I could hear them muttering to each other. I watched as they measured the fence posts, checking angles, looking for anything they could use against me. It was pathetic, really. They were scrambling, trying to find any excuse to justify their overreach. Instead of confronting them, I turned on my security cameras and let them dig their own hole. If they tried anything, I'd have video evidence of their continued harassment. Later that evening, I got another official-looking letter from the HOA. This one was more aggressive. They claimed the fence was an unauthorized structure that disrupted the neighborhood's appearance and demanded its removal within 72 hours. Failure to comply, they warned, would result in escalating fines. I nearly rolled my eyes. They were grasping at straws. They knew they couldn't claim my backyard as community property anymore, so now they were pivoting to aesthetics. Unfortunately for them, I had already been several steps ahead. I forwarded the letter to Lisa, who responded almost immediately. She was already drafting a formal reply, but she also had another suggestion, taking this to the county zoning board. If the HOA wanted to play legal games, I was more than happy to take it to a higher authority. The next morning, I had a surprise waiting for me. Someone had vandalized my fence. Black spray paint covered one of the panels, the word "remove" scrawled in large, dripping letters. I took a deep breath, forcing down the anger rising in my chest. This wasn't just HOA pettiness anymore. This was an outright attack. I checked my security footage and, unsurprisingly, caught a familiar figure sneaking onto my property in the early hours of the morning. It wasn't Karren this time, but one of her close allies on the board, a smug-looking man named Gerald. I immediately sent the footage to Lisa. This wasn't just trespassing anymore. This was vandalism, and I fully intended to press charges. Lisa agreed. She drafted another letter, this time not just threatening legal action, but formally filing a complaint with local law enforcement. By midday, I had a police officer at my door, reviewing the footage. With clear evidence of trespassing and property damage, they had enough to bring Gerald in for questioning. As the officer drove off, I couldn't help but smile. Karren's little empire was falling apart, one desperate mistake at a time. That evening, the neighborhood was buzzing again, but this time, the whispers weren't just about Karren. Word had spread fast about Gerald being investigated for vandalism. People were starting to see just how deep the HOA's corruption ran. I received multiple messages from neighbors, some offering support, others quietly admitting that they had also been targeted by the HOA's bullying tactics. One neighbor, a retired veteran named Tom stopped by to chat. He had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone and had seen Karren rise to power. He admitted that he had kept his head down for years, afraid of retaliation, but now he was ready to fight back. We sat on my porch discussing next steps. If we wanted real change, we needed to rally the community. Over the next few days, we gathered signatures from homeowners who were tired of the HOA's abuse. The goal was simple: force a recall vote against Karren and her cronies. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the tide had officially turned. We walked in with a petition signed by over half the neighborhood, demanding an immediate vote to remove Karren from her position. The board members, those who hadn't already distanced themselves from her, looked stunned. Karren tried to fight back, tried to claim that the signatures were invalid, but it was useless. The community had spoken. The vote was swift and decisive. Karren was officially removed as HOA president, along with Gerald and 2 others who had been complicit in her schemes. As she stormed out of the meeting, fuming, I couldn't help but feel a deep satisfaction. My backyard was mine, my fence was staying, and the HOA, they had just learned a very painful lesson. Mess with the wrong homeowner and you'll lose everything. With the recall vote settled and Karren officially ousted, the neighborhood shifted in a way I hadn't seen before. People who had once avoided eye contact at HOA meetings were now talking freely, exchanging stories about all the nonsense they'd put up with for years. It was like a collective weight had been lifted. But I knew better than to assume it was over. Karren wasn't the type to go quietly, and I had a feeling she still had a few desperate moves left in her. 2 days after the meeting, I caught sight of her pacing outside her house while talking animatedly on the phone. Her expression was tight with frustration, her free hand gesturing wildly. I couldn't hear her exact words, but I didn't need to. She was trying to regain control in some way, but with her position gone, her influence had crumbled. Later that evening, Tom knocked on my door with an update. He had been digging into some of the HOA's financial records, now that the new board was cooperating. The numbers weren't adding up. There were expenses listed for services that had never been performed, inflated fees for minor maintenance, and payments made to a company that didn't seem to exist. In short, Karren and her inner circle had been lining their pockets for years. The new board had already started an audit, but if what Tom had found was even a fraction of the full picture, Karren wasn't just looking at losing her position, she was looking at legal trouble. The next morning, I woke up to find something unusual in my front yard. A bright red notice had been placed on my fence, stamped with an official-looking seal. At first, I thought it was another weak attempt by the HOA to intimidate me, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't from them. It was from the county zoning office. Apparently, someone had filed a complaint about my fence, claiming it violated city ordinances. Not HOA rules, but actual county regulations. I didn't have to guess who was behind it. Karren had lost her power over the HOA, so she was trying to use the county to get back at me. I immediately called Lisa, who wasn't the least bit surprised. She told me to send her a copy of the notice and that she'd handle it. By noon, she had already spoken to the zoning office and confirmed that the complaint was baseless. My fence was within legal limits, and the county had no real reason to take action. The notice was just a procedural response to the complaint, but it had no actual enforcement behind it. Still, it was proof that Karren hadn't given up. That night, my security cameras caught movement again. This time, it wasn't just one person, it was 2, Karren and Gerald. They stood near my fence, whispering, pointing at it like they were planning something. I watched the footage the next morning, shaking my head. They were truly desperate now. Instead of confronting them, I decided to let them make their next move, and they did. The next day, I came home to find one of my fence panels missing. Not damaged, removed. They had actually tried to dismantle it. I checked the security footage and, sure enough, there they were, Karren and Gerald, sneaking onto my property with tools in hand. They had managed to remove one panel before something must have spooked them, causing them to flee. I didn't even have to think twice before calling the police. When the officers arrived, I handed over the footage, explaining the ongoing situation. Trespassing was one thing, but now they had crossed into actual theft and property damage. The officers took it seriously. They went straight to Karren's house. I stayed on my porch, watching as they knocked on her door. It took a while before she finally answered, her expression shifting from annoyance to panic as she realized why they were there. She tried to argue, throwing out excuses about HOA regulations and community standards, but the officers weren't having it. The footage spoke for itself. Gerald wasn't home, but they told her he would be facing charges as well. By the time the officers left, Karren looked like she had aged 10 years. That evening, Tom and a few other neighbors came by to check in. The atmosphere had completely changed now. People weren't afraid of Karren anymore. If anything, they were enjoying watching her downfall. With the legal trouble piling up and the community firmly against her, it was only a matter of time before she cracked. And I was ready for whatever came next. Karren wasn't in her yard the next morning. For the first time since this entire mess started, her porch was empty, no clipboard in sight, no smug glances in my direction. It was almost unsettling. Almost. I didn't have to wait long to find out why. By mid-morning, Lisa called with an update. Karren and Gerald had both been officially charged with trespassing and vandalism. The police had reviewed all the footage and determined that their actions weren't just a simple property dispute, they had knowingly broken the law. Gerald had already lawyered up, but Karren, she had decided to fight it. That meant one thing, she wasn't done yet. Lisa wasn't worried, but I knew better than to assume Karren would go down quietly. She had spent years controlling this neighborhood, bending the rules to suit herself. Losing that power was going to make her desperate. By late afternoon, the neighborhood group chat was buzzing. Word had spread about the charges, and people were weighing in with their own experiences, stories of fines issued for imaginary violations, favoritism toward certain homeowners, and even threats against those who dared to push back. Then, someone dropped a bombshell. An anonymous message appeared in the chat, claiming Karren had been pocketing HOA funds for years, funneling them through fake maintenance requests and fabricated expenses. That explained the inconsistencies Tom had found in the HOA's financial records. The new board wasted no time calling an emergency meeting. This time, it wasn't just the usual attendees. The entire neighborhood showed up, eager to hear just how deep Karren's corruption ran. I sat near the back, watching as the new HOA president, a level-headed woman named Sandra, laid it all out. The financial audit had uncovered tens of thousands of dollars in misappropriated funds. HOA dues had been used to pay for personal expenses, including luxury vacations, home renovations, and even a private security system for Karren's house, one that mysteriously disappeared after she lost the presidency. The outrage was immediate. Homeowners who had been fined for minor infractions were now learning that their money had been used to fund Karren's lavish lifestyle. People were furious, demanding legal action, demanding refunds, demanding justice. Sandra assured everyone that legal proceedings were already underway. Civil charges could be filed, and if the evidence was strong enough, criminal charges wouldn't be far behind. Then came the best part. The new board had reached out to the county to verify property records, just in case Karren had tried her land grab tactics on anyone else. She had. At least 3 other homeowners had received similar claims, pressured into donating portions of their land to the HOA under the guise of community improvement projects. Two had complied out of fear, believing Karren's fabricated authority. Now, with the truth out in the open, they had grounds to reclaim their land. By the time the meeting ended, the atmosphere had shifted. People weren't just angry anymore, they were motivated. Karren had ruled through intimidation, but now that her lies had been exposed, the entire neighborhood was ready to take back control. I walked home with a sense of satisfaction, but I knew Karren wouldn't accept defeat quietly. Sure enough, the next morning, I found a moving truck parked in front of her house. At first I thought she was running, but then I saw her standing on her porch, arms crossed, glaring at me. This wasn't a retreat. This was something else. She didn't speak, didn't acknowledge anyone, just stood there as movers carried box after box out of her house. It wasn't until later that I found out the truth. Karren wasn't leaving voluntarily. She had been sued by the HOA for embezzlement, and as part of the settlement, she was being forced to sell her house to repay what she had stolen. Her reign was officially over. That evening, as the sun set, I stood in my backyard, leaning against my fence, the same fence she had tried so hard to remove. The neighborhood was quieter now. Peaceful. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid of the HOA, they weren't afraid to stand up for themselves. And Karren. She was just another bad memory, packed away in a moving truck, headed for a future she couldn't control. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past few weeks finally lift. The battle was over, and I had won.